It's about you. Your soulmate talked about you today, and something was said that you can't ignore, and the moment that led to this unexpected realization began earlier today in what seemed like an ordinary conversation. Nothing about the day appeared unusual at first. Your soulmate was simply spending time speaking with someone they trust, perhaps a close friend, a family member, or someone who often listens when they feel the need to talk openly about life. The conversation started the way many conversations do, moving casually from one topic to another. They spoke about daily responsibilities, small frustrations, plans for the future, and the way life sometimes feels like it moves faster than anyone can keep up with. There was laughter during parts of the conversation, the kind that appears naturally when people are comfortable with each other. At first it seemed like just another exchange of thoughts between two people who know each other well. But then the conversation slowly began drifting toward deeper topics, the kind of reflections people only share when they feel safe enough to speak honestly. Your soulmate started talking about the past, not in a dramatic way, but in a thoughtful one. They mentioned how certain moments from earlier in life sometimes return unexpectedly, especially when someone is thinking about what truly mattered to them during those times. The person they were speaking with listened carefully, encouraging the reflection without interrupting. And somewhere in the middle of that quiet exchange, your name appeared. It was not planned or prepared. Your soulmate did not say your name with any dramatic emphasis or intention to turn the conversation in a particular direction. It simply emerged naturally from the memory they were describing. But the moment it was spoken, something about the atmosphere of the conversation shifted slightly. The person listening noticed it immediately, even if your soulmate did not fully realize it yet. When someone speaks about a person who once held emotional meaning in their life, there is often something subtle in the way they talk about them, something that reveals the memory is still alive rather than distant. Your soulmate may have begun describing a moment connected to you, perhaps recalling a conversation you once had together or a time when the two of you shared a genuine connection that felt easy and natural. They might have spoken about it casually at first, almost as if it were simply another memory among many others. Yet as they continued speaking, they began noticing that the details of that moment came back more clearly than they expected. Sometimes memories do that. They arrive quietly at first, but once someone starts describing them out loud, the emotions attached to them begin surfacing again. The person listening noticed this change in your soulmate's tone. What started as a simple story about the past was slowly becoming something more reflective. Your soulmate may have paused for a moment, searching for the right words to explain why that memory felt meaningful. They might have said something about how certain connections feel different from others, how sometimes two people understand each other in ways that do not require explanation. When they described the connection you once shared, the sincerity in their voice made it clear that the memory was not just a casual recollection. The listener may have leaned forward slightly or smiled in recognition of what they were hearing. People often notice emotional truth before the person speaking realizes they are revealing it. Your soulmate may have continued explaining the moment, describing how the conversation between you once felt effortless, how time seemed to move differently when both of you were sharing your thoughts. They may have mentioned how certain memories stand out in life because they carry a sense of authenticity, moments when someone feels completely comfortable being themselves. The listener could see that the memory meant more than your soulmate was initially admitting. It was not just a story about the past. It was a glimpse into something that had quietly remained important in their heart. At some point during the conversation, the listener gently asked a question. It was not an intense or confrontational question, but it carried enough insight to make your soulmate stop and think. They might have asked something like, "Do you still think about that connection sometimes?" Or, "It sounds like that moment meant more to you than you realized back then." Questions like that can create a pause in a conversation because they encourage someone to look at their own feelings more honestly. Your soulmate may have been silent for a moment after hearing it. Silence often appears when someone realizes they are being asked to acknowledge something they had not fully examined before. They might have taken a breath and then continued speaking, but this time their words were more thoughtful. Instead of describing the memory as just another story, they began reflecting on why it had stayed with them for so long. They may have admitted that certain experiences in life leave impressions that do not disappear even when time passes and circumstances change. The listener recognized that your soulmate was beginning to understand something important about their own emotions. By speaking about you out loud, they had unintentionally uncovered a realization that had been quietly waiting beneath the surface. Conversations like this sometimes become turning points because they allow someone to see their own memories from a different perspective. Your soulmate may have realized that the connection they were describing had shaped their understanding of authenticity and emotional honesty more than they previously thought. The listener might have smiled gently and said something simple but meaningful, perhaps reminding them that some connections remain important because they represent a time when everything felt genuine. Hearing that observation could have made your soulmate pause again, recognizing that speaking about you had stirred emotions they had not expected to revisit today. The conversation may have continued after that moment, moving on to other topics the way conversations naturally do. But something about it had changed. By saying your name and describing the connection you once shared, your soulmate had opened a door to reflection they had not planned to explore. And even after the conversation ended, the realization that emerged from it remained quietly present in their thoughts. After that brief pause in the conversation, the atmosphere between your soulmate and the person they were speaking with changed in a subtle but meaningful way. What had begun as a casual reflection about the past had now turned into a moment where emotions were being examined more honestly than your soulmate expected. The question that had been asked lingered quietly in their mind, encouraging them to think about the connection they had just described. At first they might have tried to continue speaking in the same relaxed tone they used earlier, but something about the situation made it difficult to treat the memory as something ordinary. When someone speaks about a moment that still carries emotional weight, the act of describing it out loud often reveals feelings they had not fully acknowledged before. Your soulmate may have started explaining more details about the time they were remembering, perhaps recalling the circumstances that brought you into their life and the way the connection between you developed naturally. They might have described how the conversations between you felt different from most interactions they had with others, how the words seemed to flow without effort and how both of you understood each other in ways that felt genuine. The listener noticed these details carefully, recognizing that your soulmate was not simply telling a story but rediscovering something important about their past. As they continued speaking, your soulmate may have realized that the memories they were describing still felt vivid even after so much time had passed. It surprised them how easily they could recall specific moments, perhaps the tone of a conversation, the way laughter appeared unexpectedly during a simple exchange, or the feeling that time seemed to slow down when both of you were sharing your thoughts openly. These kinds of memories tend to stay with people because they represent authenticity, a rare sense of emotional comfort that does not always appear in everyday interactions. The person listening to your soulmate understood that this was more than just nostalgia. Nostalgia usually carries a gentle warmth but does not require deep explanation. What your soulmate was experiencing felt different. They were trying to understand why this particular connection had remained meaningful in their mind long after life had moved forward. At some point the listener may have said something that sounded simple but carried a deeper observation, perhaps mentioning that the way your soulmate spoke about you suggested that the connection had never fully left their heart. Hearing that might have made your soulmate pause again, not because they disagreed but because they had never looked at the situation from that perspective before. Sometimes it takes an outside voice to reveal what someone has been quietly carrying inside without realizing it. Your soulmate may have reflected on the idea for a moment before responding, acknowledging that certain experiences in life leave impressions that do not fade easily. They might have explained that even though time had passed and circumstances had changed, the authenticity of that connection remained part of their emotional memory. The conversation gradually became more reflective, less about telling a story and more about understanding what that story meant. Your soulmate may have admitted that the moment they described was one of the times in their life when everything felt genuine and uncomplicated. It was not defined by expectations or pressure. It simply existed because two people were able to share a space where honesty felt natural. The listener recognized the sincerity behind those words and allowed the silence that followed to exist without interrupting it. Silence in conversations like this often means that something meaningful has just been realized. Your soulmate may have looked down for a moment or taken a breath before continuing, realizing that speaking about you had uncovered feelings they had not expected to revisit today. They may have explained that certain connections shape how a person understands emotional closeness, even years later. When someone experiences authenticity like that, it becomes part of how they measure other relationships in the future. The listener nodded in understanding, perhaps sharing their own perspective about how meaningful moments sometimes reveal their importance only after time has passed. By the time the conversation moved forward again, your soulmate was aware that something had shifted inside them. The act of speaking about you had turned a memory into a realization. Even though the discussion eventually continued toward other topics, the reflection created by that moment remained quietly present in their thoughts, reminding them that some connections never truly lose their significance once they have been experienced honestly. As the conversation continued after that reflective pause, your soulmate found themselves thinking more deeply about what they had just said and how unexpectedly natural it felt to talk about you again. Sometimes when someone begins speaking about a memory they have not revisited for a long time, the act of describing it out loud unlocks details that were quietly waiting beneath the surface of their thoughts. That is exactly what began happening during this moment. Your soulmate had originally mentioned your name almost casually, as part of a story connected to an earlier time in their life. But once the listener encouraged them to think about the meaning behind that memory, the simple story started evolving into something more personal. They began remembering additional details that had not appeared in their mind for years, small moments that once felt ordinary but now seemed more significant when viewed with distance and maturity. They may have spoken about the atmosphere of those moments rather than just the events themselves, describing how the connection between you felt natural and unforced. Perhaps there were conversations where both of you could express your thoughts honestly without worrying about whether you would be misunderstood. Maybe there were moments of laughter that appeared spontaneously because being around each other created a sense of ease that was rare in their life. The listener noticed how clearly your soulmate described those experiences, and the sincerity in their voice revealed that the memory was not just something they were recalling but something they were rediscovering emotionally. As your soulmate continued speaking, they may have realized that the connection they were describing had quietly influenced how they understood relationships over the years. Even when life moved forward and new experiences appeared, the authenticity they once felt during those moments had remained a reference point in their mind. They might have explained that certain interactions with people in the present sometimes reminded them of the way conversations with you once felt, and those comparisons often made them recognize how unique that earlier connection had been. The listener listened carefully, understanding that your soulmate was beginning to see their past from a new perspective. Sometimes it takes years for someone to recognize how important a certain experience truly was, especially if life carried them quickly into other responsibilities and directions afterward. Your soulmate may have admitted that they had never fully considered the significance of that connection while it was happening. At the time it simply felt natural, like something that existed without needing explanation. But speaking about it now revealed that the memory had stayed vivid because it represented something genuine in their life. The listener might have asked another thoughtful question, something that encouraged your soulmate to reflect even further. Perhaps they wondered whether your soulmate had ever thought about reaching out to you again or whether they believed the connection was meant to remain a meaningful part of their past. Questions like that can create a quiet moment of hesitation because they invite someone to consider possibilities they had not explored before. Your soulmate may have taken a moment before answering, thinking carefully about how to describe their feelings honestly. They might have explained that life had moved forward in ways that made revisiting the past seem complicated, and that sometimes people assume certain chapters are meant to remain memories rather than continuing into the present. Yet as they said those words, they may have realized that speaking about the connection had already changed how they saw it. Instead of feeling distant, the memory now felt present in a way that surprised them. The listener could see that realization unfolding and gently acknowledged it, perhaps mentioning that some connections leave a lasting impression because they represent a time when everything felt authentic and emotionally real. Hearing that observation may have made your soulmate reflect even more deeply. They began recognizing that the reason the memory felt so vivid was because it had been one of those rare moments where emotional honesty existed without effort. The connection between you had not required explanation or careful planning, it simply happened because both of you understood each other naturally. That kind of experience can shape a person's emotional perspective long after the moment itself has passed. As the conversation gradually moved toward other topics, your soulmate was still quietly thinking about what had been said. Even though the discussion continued, the reflection created by that moment remained with them. Speaking about you had revealed something important about their own feelings, something they had not expected to rediscover today. It reminded them that certain connections leave impressions that do not disappear easily, and sometimes all it takes is one honest conversation for those memories to become meaningful again. As the conversation continued moving forward, your soulmate noticed that even though the topic had gradually shifted toward other things, their mind kept returning to the moment when your name had been mentioned. It was almost as if something inside them had been quietly awakened, and once that awareness appeared, it refused to disappear as easily as they expected. The person they were speaking with may have started talking about different parts of life again. Daily routines, plans, work, or other personal stories, but your soulmate found themselves listening while still thinking about the reflection that had just taken place. When someone unexpectedly revisits a meaningful memory, the experience can stay with them long after the conversation changes direction. Your soulmate may have realized that describing the connection they once shared with you had felt strangely natural, even though it had been a long time since they spoke about it in that level of detail. That realization alone may have made them pause internally and ask themselves why the memory felt so present today. At first they might have told themselves that it was simply nostalgia, the kind of reflection people have when they think about earlier chapters of their life. But the more they thought about it, the more they recognized that what they were feeling was different from ordinary nostalgia. Nostalgia usually carries a gentle warmth that fades quickly once the moment passes. What your soulmate was experiencing felt deeper than that. The conversation had not only reminded them of a moment from the past, it had revealed the emotional significance behind that moment in a way they had never fully examined before. They began thinking about the details they had described earlier, the conversations you once shared, the way your interactions felt effortless, and the sense that both of you understood each other without needing long explanations. Those memories were not just stories anymore, they had become reminders of what emotional authenticity once felt like in their life. Your soulmate may have realized that experiences like that are rare. Many relationships involve effort, expectations, or misunderstandings that make people feel as though they are constantly adjusting themselves. But the connection they remembered with you felt different because it existed naturally, without pressure. That realization made them see the memory with new clarity. They might have looked at the person sitting across from them during the conversation and wondered whether they should say something more about what they had just discovered. Yet sometimes people hesitate to continue discussing something personal because they are still trying to understand their own feelings first. Instead of immediately returning to the topic, your soulmate may have simply listened while the conversation continued, quietly reflecting on what had been said earlier. The listener who had asked those thoughtful questions probably sensed that your soulmate was still thinking about it, even though they did not bring it up again right away. People who understand emotional conversations often recognize when someone is processing something meaningful internally. Your soulmate may have felt a mixture of curiosity and surprise about their own reaction. They might have wondered why speaking about you had felt so significant after so much time had passed. The answer slowly began appearing in their thoughts as they reflected more carefully. The connection you once shared represented a time when everything felt emotionally genuine. There was no need to hide feelings or carefully choose every word. Instead, the interaction felt honest and comfortable, the kind of experience that stays with a person because it reveals what true understanding between two people can feel like. As this realization grew clearer, your soulmate began recognizing that the memory had quietly influenced the way they understood relationships over the years. Even when they did not actively think about it, that experience had shaped their expectations of emotional authenticity. They may have noticed that sometimes when they met new people or formed connections later in life, they subconsciously compared those interactions to the ease they once felt with you. That comparison may have remained unspoken in their mind for years, but today's conversation finally brought it into focus. The listener who had encouraged them to reflect may not have realized just how meaningful that moment was becoming. Yet by asking simple questions and allowing your soulmate to describe the memory honestly, they had helped reveal something that had been quietly waiting beneath the surface for a long time. By the time the conversation eventually came to an end and both people prepared to go their separate ways, your soulmate understood that something had shifted in their thoughts. Speaking about you had turned a distant memory into a present realization. It reminded them that certain connections leave impressions that do not disappear simply because time passes. And even after the conversation ended, the reflection created by that moment remained quietly with them, encouraging them to think about the meaning behind the connection they had just rediscovered. As the conversation eventually came to a natural pause and your soulmate found themselves alone again later in the day, the thoughts that had been awakened during the discussion did not disappear the way they might have expected. In fact, the quiet that followed seemed to give those reflections even more space to grow. When people return to their own thoughts after a meaningful conversation, they often begin replaying certain moments in their mind, examining what was said and what it might reveal about their feelings. Your soulmate may have found themselves doing exactly that. The moment when your name first appeared in the conversation stood out clearly in their memory. They remembered how casually it had been spoken at first, and how quickly the atmosphere shifted when the listener noticed the sincerity behind the story they were telling. That moment, which seemed small while it was happening, now felt much more significant as they thought about it again. Your soulmate may have realized that the reason it stayed with them was because speaking about you had unlocked something emotional that had been quietly resting in their heart for a long time. It was not just the memory itself that mattered, it was the realization of what that memory represented. They began thinking about the connection they had described earlier, recognizing that it had been one of the few experiences in their life where emotional honesty felt effortless. Many relationships require people to navigate expectations, misunderstandings, or unspoken boundaries that make conversations feel complicated. But the moments they remembered with you had been different. They recalled how easily both of you could share thoughts without worrying about how they would be received, how the interaction felt natural rather than forced. That authenticity was what made the memory so vivid now. Your soulmate may have sat quietly for a while, reflecting on the way the listener reacted when they told that story. The person they were speaking with had noticed something important even before your soulmate fully understood it themselves. By asking those thoughtful questions, the listener had gently encouraged them to examine their feelings more closely. Sometimes an outside perspective can reveal truths that remain hidden when someone is thinking about their life alone. Your soulmate began realizing that the connection they once shared with you had never truly been just another memory. Instead, it had quietly shaped their understanding of what genuine connection feels like. Over the years they may not have consciously thought about it very often, but the emotional impression of those moments had remained part of their perspective. When they interacted with others later in life, they sometimes felt a subtle awareness of whether those interactions carried the same authenticity they once experienced. Speaking about you today had made that awareness suddenly clearer. The realization may have surprised them because they had always assumed that time gradually softens the emotional significance of earlier experiences. Yet what they discovered during that conversation was that some connections remain meaningful precisely because they were genuine. Authentic experiences leave traces that do not easily fade, even when circumstances change. Your soulmate may have wondered why they had never allowed themselves to reflect on that connection in this way before. Perhaps life had simply moved too quickly, filling their attention with responsibilities and new experiences that made it easy to believe the past had already settled into its place. But now, after describing those memories aloud, they could see them with a different perspective. Instead of appearing distant, the connection felt present again in a quiet but powerful way. They may have walked around or continued with their daily tasks while these thoughts lingered in the background of their mind. Sometimes reflections like this unfold slowly, revealing new layers of understanding as a person continues thinking about them. Your soulmate might have remembered additional moments they had not mentioned during the conversation, small details that once seemed ordinary but now felt important. A certain phrase you once said during a conversation, the tone of laughter you shared during a simple moment, or the feeling of being understood without needing to explain everything. These memories carried a sense of warmth, but they also carried clarity. They reminded your soulmate that some experiences remain part of who we are long after they occur. As the day continued and the conversation became something that had technically ended, the reflection it created did not end at all. Instead, it continued unfolding quietly inside your soulmate's thoughts. They began realizing that speaking about you had opened a door to understanding their own emotional history in a new way. It showed them that certain connections have a lasting influence not because they were dramatic or complicated, but because they were real. And the more they thought about it, the more they understood why the words spoken during that conversation were something they could not easily ignore. As the day continued after that conversation and your soulmate moved through the rest of their routine, the reflection that had been triggered earlier did not fade away the way many passing thoughts usually do. Instead, it stayed quietly present in their mind, returning again and again during small moments of silence. Sometimes when a person has an unexpected realization during a conversation, it takes time for the meaning of that realization to fully unfold. At first it appears as a simple thought, something interesting or surprising that was said, but as the hours pass and the mind returns to it repeatedly, the deeper significance begins to reveal itself. Your soulmate may have experienced exactly that. While continuing with everyday tasks, they found themselves replaying the conversation in their head, especially the moment when your name first appeared and the reaction that followed. They remembered how casually they had spoken about the memory at first, almost as if it were just another story from their past. Yet the listener had noticed something in their tone that your soulmate had not fully recognized themselves. That small observation had encouraged them to describe the connection in more detail, and once they began doing that, the emotions behind the memory started becoming clearer. Now, hours later, your soulmate was realizing that speaking about you had brought back a feeling they had not expected to experience again. It was the feeling of authenticity, the sense that there was once a time when conversations between two people felt completely natural and emotionally honest. Many interactions in life are shaped by expectations, responsibilities, or the need to present ourselves in a certain way. But the connection they remembered with you had been different. It allowed them to speak freely, to share thoughts without hesitation, and to feel understood without needing long explanations. As your soulmate reflected on this, they began noticing how strongly that memory stood apart from many other experiences in their life. They might have wondered why they had never paused to examine the importance of that connection before now. Perhaps life had simply moved too quickly for them to reflect on it properly. When people are focused on responsibilities or building their future, they often assume that earlier chapters have already been resolved. Yet today's conversation had revealed something different, that certain emotional experiences remain meaningful long after time passes. Your soulmate may have realized that the reason this reflection felt so powerful was because the connection with you had shaped their understanding of emotional closeness in subtle ways. Even if they had not consciously thought about it, that experience had influenced how they recognized authenticity in other relationships. They might have remembered moments when they met new people or formed connections later in life and felt an unspoken comparison in their mind. Sometimes those interactions felt pleasant but lacked the same natural understanding they once experienced with you. Those quiet comparisons may have remained in the background of their thoughts for years, never fully explained or acknowledged. But after speaking about the memory today, they could finally see why those comparisons existed. The connection you shared had created a reference point in their emotional memory, a reminder of what it feels like when two people understand each other effortlessly. Your soulmate may have paused during one of their daily activities, realizing how unusual it was that this reflection still held their attention hours later. Most conversations fade quickly once they are finished, replaced by new tasks or distractions. Yet this one remained present because it had uncovered something important about their own feelings. They might have thought about the person they were speaking with earlier and recognized how perceptive that listener had been. By asking simple but thoughtful questions, they had helped reveal a truth your soulmate had not been consciously aware of. Sometimes people carry emotional memories for years without realizing how significant they are until someone else encourages them to describe those moments honestly. That is exactly what had happened during that conversation. As the evening approached and the day began winding down, your soulmate may have felt a quiet sense of clarity about what the reflection meant. It was not necessarily about returning to the past or trying to change what had already happened. Instead, it was about recognizing the emotional truth behind a connection that had once been meaningful. They understood now that speaking about you had not been random. It had been the result of a memory that still carried authenticity and warmth. And even though the conversation itself had ended earlier in the day, the understanding it created remained with them, reminding them that some connections continue influencing the heart long after the moment itself has passed. As the evening gradually arrived and the day began settling into a quieter rhythm, your soulmate realized that the conversation from earlier still had not left their mind. Even after hours had passed, they continued thinking about what had been said and, more importantly, what had been discovered during that moment of reflection. Sometimes when someone unexpectedly speaks about a memory that carries emotional meaning, the realization does not appear all at once. Instead, it unfolds slowly throughout the day, revealing new thoughts each time the mind returns to it. That was exactly what your soulmate was experiencing now. They might have been sitting quietly, perhaps looking out a window, walking through familiar surroundings, or simply pausing between daily tasks when the memory of the conversation appeared again. The moment your name had been mentioned stood out clearly, almost as if the mind had marked that point in time as something important. At first they had spoken about you casually, describing the memory as though it were simply part of the past. But the listener's response had gently shifted the direction of the conversation. By asking thoughtful questions and encouraging them to explain more, that person had unintentionally guided your soulmate toward a realization they had never fully explored before. As your soulmate replayed that moment again, they began noticing how natural it had felt to talk about you. Even though time had passed and life had moved forward, the details of the connection remained vivid in their mind. They could remember the atmosphere of those moments, the feeling of ease in the way both of you communicated, and the sense that the connection existed without needing to be defined or explained. Experiences like that tend to remain powerful because they reveal something rare about human connection, the ability to feel understood without effort. Your soulmate began recognizing that this authenticity was what made the memory so meaningful even now. They might have thought about other conversations or relationships in their life and noticed how different that earlier connection felt by comparison. Many interactions involve uncertainty, hesitation, or the need to present ourselves carefully. But the memory they described earlier carried none of those things. Instead, it reflected a time when honesty felt natural and conversations flowed without barriers. Realizing this made them understand why the listener's observation had stayed with them throughout the day. The person they were speaking with had recognized the emotional truth behind the story even before your soulmate fully realized it themselves. Sometimes an outside perspective helps reveal what our own minds overlook. As these reflections continued unfolding, your soulmate may have begun asking themselves new questions about why that connection still felt significant after so much time had passed. They may have wondered whether certain experiences remain important because they represent moments when life felt genuine. When people encounter authenticity in relationships, it often becomes a quiet reference point in their memory. Even if they do not consciously compare every new interaction to that experience, the feeling remains somewhere in their understanding of what emotional closeness should be. Your soulmate may have recognized that the connection they once shared with you had become exactly that, a reference point that shaped how they recognized sincerity and emotional honesty in others. As they thought about it more deeply, they may have realized that speaking about you earlier had not only brought back memories but had also helped them understand something about themselves. It showed them that certain connections are not easily replaced or forgotten because they represent a time when everything felt authentic. The listener's simple observation during the conversation had acted like a mirror, allowing your soulmate to see their own feelings more clearly. Even though the conversation itself had ended hours ago, the insight it created continued growing in meaning as they reflected on it throughout the evening. By the time the day was reaching its quiet conclusion, your soulmate understood that the moment when your name was spoken had become more than just a passing memory during a conversation. It had turned into a realization about the emotional truth behind that connection. And while they may not yet know exactly what that realization will lead to, they knew one thing clearly: the memory of that moment and the words spoken during that conversation were not something they could easily ignore. As the night finally arrived and the quiet of the day settled around them, your soulmate found themselves returning once again to the conversation that had taken place earlier. The more time that passed, the more they realized that what happened during that discussion had not simply been a casual moment of remembering the past. It had uncovered something deeper, something that had quietly remained inside their thoughts for much longer than they realized. When people revisit meaningful memories during a conversation, the significance of those memories often becomes clearer later, when they are alone with their thoughts. That was exactly what your soulmate was experiencing now. They might have been sitting quietly at home, perhaps reflecting on the day while the world around them slowed down for the night. In that silence, the moment when your name was mentioned came back to them again with surprising clarity. At first they had spoken about the memory naturally, almost without thinking about it. But as the listener responded and encouraged them to reflect more deeply, the meaning behind that memory began revealing itself in ways they had not expected. Now, hours later, your soulmate understood that the conversation had done something important. it had allowed them to see their own emotional history with greater honesty. The connection they once shared with you was no longer just another story from the past. Instead, it had become a reminder of a time when life felt genuine and emotionally open. They began thinking about the details they described earlier, the conversations that flowed easily between you, the moments when laughter appeared without effort, and the sense that understanding existed naturally without needing explanation. Experiences like that tend to remain powerful because they represent authenticity, a feeling that many people search for throughout their lives. Your soulmate realized that the reason the memory stayed so vivid in their mind was because it carried that authenticity. It was not just about what happened, it was about how it felt. When two people connect in a way that feels honest and natural, those moments often leave a lasting impression that does not disappear even when time passes. As your soulmate reflected on this realization, they began seeing the earlier conversation in a new light. The listener who had asked those thoughtful questions had unknowingly helped reveal something that had been hidden beneath everyday life. By encouraging your soulmate to describe the memory honestly, they had helped them recognize how meaningful that connection truly was. Sometimes people move through life assuming that earlier chapters have already ended, without realizing that those experiences continue influencing how they see the world. Your soulmate now understood that the connection they once shared with you had quietly shaped their understanding of emotional closeness. Even when they were not actively thinking about it, the memory remained part of their perspective. They might have remembered times when new relationships or conversations in their life felt pleasant but somehow lacked the same natural understanding they once experienced. Those subtle comparisons had existed in their mind for years, even if they had never spoken about them out loud. Speaking about you today had brought that realization into focus. As they continued reflecting, your soulmate may have felt a mixture of warmth and clarity. Warmth because remembering those moments reminded them of a time when life felt emotionally genuine, and clarity because the conversation had helped them understand why the memory still mattered. It was not simply nostalgia or curiosity, it was the recognition that certain connections leave an imprint that remains part of who we are. By the time the night was growing late and the day was finally coming to an end, your soulmate understood that what happened earlier was something they could not easily dismiss. The conversation had revealed an emotional truth that had been quietly waiting to be acknowledged. It reminded them that some experiences remain meaningful long after the moment itself has passed, and sometimes it takes a simple conversation for that truth to appear clearly again. Even as the night continued and they prepared to rest, the reflection created by that moment stayed with them, reminding them that certain connections are never completely forgotten once they have been experienced with honesty.